Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the second session in this discussion on exploiting the full power of SDRs. The Center for Global Development is proud to be co-sponsoring this event with the Government of France in its role as President of the Council of the European Union. The event will be in French and English. The events page you use to register has links to the appropriate language page. We're having some technical difficulties with the French page. They will be solved in a few minutes, we hope. La séance sera présentée en français et en anglais. La page d'inscription contient des liens pour chaque langue. On a des problèmes techniques à ce moment avec la traduction française. Donc, ça sera disponible dans les meilleurs délais. Yesterday's session considered how the $650 billion allocation of SDRs granted in 2021 has been used by countries and what the plans are for recycling advanced countries' SDRs through the IMF, particularly through the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which the IMF is in the process of formulating. The discussion revealed a wide variety of direct uses of countries' SDRs, including providing a monetary reserve cushion and/or extra fiscal space for some governments. There was considerable discussion of the RST modalities as well. If you missed yesterday's session, the live broadcast, you can see the recording on CGD's website in both French and English. Today, we'll consider possible ways for using SDRs outside the confines of the country's own use or channeling them through the IMF. While the G20 has pledged channeling of $100 billion of SDRs to vulnerable countries, it's unclear where that money will go. The PRGT is projected to need about 30 billion more and the RST about 50 billion. So that leaves at least $20 billion looking for a way to be used. And that's to say nothing of the remaining $300 billion worth of SDRs that advanced countries do not need and could be put to good use in vulnerable countries. Many advanced countries are hesitating and committing to rechannel SDRs until they see exactly where and how they're going to be used. Lots of advocates and researchers have been looking for other alternatives for SDR channeling. There are many proposals on the table, and we'll hear at least two of them today. But all the proposals run into technical difficulties. In particular, the insistence by the G20 and the central bankers of the world that any rechanneling preserve the so-called reserve asset characteristic of the SDR. The SDRs must be easily reclaimable by donating countries and continue to function as a central bank reserve asset. This is a high technical hurdle, but I'm convinced it can be overcome if there's the political will to do so. Unfortunately, we have a political vicious circle. Absent a sound technical proposal, there'll be no political push, and absent political push, the technical hurdles will seem insurmountable. So today is about both those subjects, technique and political will. As others mentioned yesterday, the SDR allocation of August 2021 was the only truly global financing effort that has been made to address the economic crisis stemming from the pandemic. Yet almost 6 months after the allocation, the world's financial leaders are still figuring out how to use the SDRs to help pull the global economy out of the crisis. In fact, there are 3 steps to ensure SDRs have their full impact: the allocation, the rechanneling, and then getting them into the coffers of vulnerable countries so they can be used. The allocation's done. Some part of the reallocation is in the offing, or the rechanneling is in the offing, but no supplementary SDRs have been delivered to vulnerable countries beyond those given to them in August. So we're far from declaring success. I would challenge today's panelists to push the boundaries on SDR allocation, not just with ideas, but with practical solutions to move forward. We must overcome the political and technical stasis that currently exists. And has been said in too many forums about all aspects of this crisis, time is of the essence. Yet we're moving at a business as usual pace, not the crisis pace that's demanded. I hope today's session will give a strong push to move forward more quickly. Let me now turn the floor over to today's moderator, my good friend and colleague, Masoud Ahmed, the president of CGD. Masoud?
Thank you very much, Mark, and welcome to everyone. Welcome to our distinguished panelists. So it's my role today to moderate this discussion on the topic that Mark has just laid out, and following up from what was a very lively and I thought productive conversation we had yesterday, focusing more on the countries and how they were using it. And today we're going to have a chance to do a little bit more of a deep dive on some of the more innovative ideas for using SDRs. And we have a full program. So the way we are planning to proceed is that I will first call upon Madame Shabalala, who's the Senior Vice President of the African Development Bank, and Madame Nsele, who is the Vice President of the African Development Bank, I would say that the African Development Bank is probably blazing the trail at the moment and coming up with a proposal on how the multilateral development banks might be able to use SDR. So we'll get a presentation from them on their current thinking. Then I'm going to turn to Avinash Persaud, who is the special envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados. And Avinash has been thinking about this set of issues and writing about them, and very much hope to get his perspective as well. So having got these two presentations, we're going to turn then to three discussants who will give us their take on how feasible these proposals are, what might be the obstacles that need to be overcome, how to overcome them. And they are Dodi Waluyo, who is the Deputy Governor of the Bank Indonesia. And just to remind everyone, Indonesia this year is also the chair of the G20, and that's where a lot of this discussion will take place. William Roos, who's the Assistant Secretary for Multilateral Development and Trade Affairs and for the G20 and IFA Working Group in the French Treasury. And William has also been very much in the deep thinking on this whole set of proposals around us. And finally, Professor Jayati Ghosh, who's a professor of economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, and again has been very actively writing and thinking about these issues. Then, so these will be about 7 minutes each, the discussants. Then we will open it up and get questions from comments from the audience who will be sending in questions. We will also have a chance for panelists, if they wish to interact with each other on any point that has been raised, to do so. And then to bring it to a close, we're going to have short concluding remarks by Sylvie Goulard, who is the Vice Governor of the Banque de France, and Emmanuel Moulin, who is the Director General for Trésor in France, and also our partner in organizing this event. And just to note that Jayati has very nicely put in the chat a small correction as to my introduction, and she is currently Professor of Economics at University of Massachusetts in Amherst. So just to be clear about that. So with that, I would like first to turn to Bajabule Shabalala. If I might turn to you first, and then to Hassatu Nsele for the presentation on how the African Development Bank is thinking about its role in helping to leverage the power of the SDRs. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Masoud, and thank you very much to the colleagues. Bonjour tout le monde from Abidjan. Thank you so very much for the opportunity to make this presentation to you today. I wanted to find out the slides, who will be driving. Okay, here we go. Thank you very much. So let me kick off by, as I said, thanking you for the opportunity, and I think this is a very, very topical matter at the moment. Let me thank the Center for Global Development and France for organizing this event. I'm here with my colleague, as you know, Ms. Nsele, and we're representing the bank president, Dr. Adeshina, who sadly could not join us today. He sends his kind regards and wishes everyone participating in the event fruitful discussions. Today, we will be sharing with you our thoughts on the challenges and opportunities represented by the largest SDR allocation in history and the important role that we can play alongside others to help the world and Africa recover from the devastation left by the pandemic. We will hopefully make the case today that MDBs like the African Development Bank have a crucial and seminal role to play in helping countries recover from the pandemic. The MDBs are an important part of the international financial architecture and should have a role to play in helping to deploy the SDRs for sustainable recovery and development. Next slide, please. The General SDR Allocation, as I said, the largest in history, provided much needed boost to global liquidity, helping to build confidence in markets, promoting stability and resilience of the global economy, and was a powerful signal of a cooperative multilateral response to the COVID-19 crisis. The provision of these unconditional reserves helped African countries address the most immediate fallouts from the COVID-19 crisis. It limited the need for quick adjustments through contractionary and potentially distortionary policies and allowed greater scope for a measured counter-cyclical response. The general allocation also provided scope for spending on African countries' crisis response, helping to protect the most vulnerable and avoiding significant and permanent economic output losses. Overall, the allocation is expected to foster systematic stability and economic resilience. Yet, and because the SDRs were allocated according to IMF members' quotas, the amount allocated to each individual country did not fully respond to their needs. Africa received only a small slice of the general SDR allocation, just over 5% and 33.5 billion in new reserves. The amount allocated to the African continent was smaller collectively than the allocation made to some of the world's advanced economies, such as the United States, amongst others. In summary, and as noted in yesterday's session by Mr. Emmanuel Moulin, a consensus has emerged on the fact that the majority of SDRs were allocated to countries that did not need them. Next slide, please. While over the last 2 decades, Africa made significant progress in terms of its own socio-economic development, the COVID-19 pandemic threatens to reverse some of these hard-earned achievements. More than 30 million Africans fell into extreme poverty in 2020, and nearly 40 million could have done so last year. The pandemic has also made it more challenging for governments to finance and address some of the continent's critical challenges, which are legion. These challenges include the fact that more than 640 million Africans have no access to energy. This lack of access to power creates poverty traps and are often accompanied by heightened security risks. By undermining job creation and investment, power shortages are estimated to cost the continent somewhere between 2 to 4% of GDP each year. In addition, Africa is the most food insecure region in the world, with more than 223 million undernourished people. The threat posed by climate change exacerbates this challenge. While Africa's contributions to global greenhouse gas emissions are minuscule at 2% of total emissions, it stands to suffer some of the biggest impacts from climate change. Recent estimates suggest that the annual cost of adapting to climate change are very high in Africa, ranging from $7 to $15 billion in 2020 and expected to increase to as high as $50 billion annually by 2050. Yet only 3% of global climate finance flows have been directed to Africa to date. The voluntary reallocation of the SDRs represents a unique opportunity to address some of these challenges and put the continent on track to meet the UN's SDGs. Next slide, please. Global leaders have been encouraging advanced economies to channel some of their SDR allocations to developing countries. The G20 and other nations have pledged nearly 45 billion from their recent SDRs allocations towards vulnerable countries against their 100 billion global target. The African Development Bank has been a leading voice in the debate on the rechanneling of SDRs and has been actively looking to develop concrete solutions to support this. Several options are being considered to channel these new SDRs to developing countries. Among these, the Multilateral Development Bank's option stands out as it makes the best use of the entire global financial architecture in a complementary way. In yesterday's session, all of you would have heard Mr. Amadou Hott, Minister of Finance of Senegal, and Mr. Ernest Addison, Governor of the Central Bank of Ghana, expressing their support for the voluntary reallocation of SDR and for channeling some of these resources through MDBs like the African Development Bank. The advantages of this option are numerous and compelling. MDBs are ready, time-tested vehicles sitting at the center of the global financial architecture. MDBs are ideally positioned to help countries and regions overcome the impacts of the pandemic, thanks to their unrivaled regional, country, and sector expertise. MDBs can deploy a very broad range of financing products to support their sovereign and non-sovereign clients. MDBs play a critical role in supporting efforts to translate the SDGs into meaningful country-level targets, policies, programs, and projects. MDBs are able to help unlock and catalyze additional public and private resources that complement their direct lending to clients. MDBs provide trusted, unbiased policy advice and technical assistance. And MDBs ensure that investments benefit the respective country and their citizens through emphasis on transparent procurement, project governance, high environmental and safeguard standards, and social consideration. But one of the strongest arguments for channeling SDRs to MDBs like the African Development Bank is leverage. When accounting for the SDRs as quasi-equity instruments, MDBs can multiply by 3 to 4 times the SDR allocation and transform SDRs from static foreign reserve assets into lending instruments to finance high priority transformational development projects. The 100 billion global goal for redirecting SDRs in the hands of the MDBs can be leveraged to between $300 to $400 billion for green development financing. And this alone is a compelling argument for us to work together to ensure that the MDBs are at the center of the global response to these recent challenges. The strong governance mechanisms in place at MDBs, mechanisms that ensure resources are invested effectively, responsibly, transparently, and with full accountability, will give comfort to developed countries who support the redirecting of their SDRs through MDBs, that these resources will be used responsibly, transparently, and sustainably with the high accountability and reporting standards of the MDBs. The African Development Bank has a diverse and granular shareholding structure. Member countries include all 54 African countries and 27 non-regional, non-borrowing countries. Project approvals require a decision by the board of directors with 2/3 majority or 70%. Typically though, decisions are made by consensus. The bank has made important strides to minimize and manage ESG risks. The bank uses a comprehensive development outcome and additionality framework, which is an ex-ante evaluation required for each project, alongside the project appraisal and credit notes to ensure that the transactions provide value and deliver on that development outcome. This makes MDBs the perfect conduit for channeling SDR resources to developing countries and vulnerable economies, and to do so in a manner that will satisfy the high expectations for accountability of countries making available these SDRs. To end my contribution here today, Let me summarize that it is our strong view that MDBs should be at the center of the global response that necessitated the largest SDR allocation in history. We are an important part of the global financial architecture, playing a complementary role in helping to ensure the financial health of the global economies. MDBs have the power of leverage, multiplying the large SDR allocation to an even more sizable envelope for development, and to use such resources to address the pressing challenge posed by climate change, among other priorities. We have the necessary and time-tested country knowledge and sector expertise, and the governance frameworks to ensure ongoing accountability for the use of these redirected SDRs. I will stop here and hand over to my colleague, with your permission, moderator. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Madame Chabalala.
Thank you so much. And now we are going to give the floor to Anatou Diop and Selim. Thank you so much.
So if we can go to the next slide, please. The African Development Bank and the African Development Fund, on the next slide, Hunter, please, are both prescribed holders of SDRs. And as Swazi has indicated, channeling SDRs through the African Development Bank can have a multiplier effect. It will complement the work done by the IMF, and it will amplify its desired medium and long-term impact from both a financial and a development perspective. $5 billion of SDRs redirected to the bank, for example, is 15 to 20 billion of financing that we can deploy in the productive economies of the continent. And indeed, through our capital markets activities, we can leverage the SDR received and offer resources at far better cost than any of our clients could access on their own, thanks to our AAA rating. And you can imagine the impact in terms of alleviating the debt burden of our countries that have to go to the capital markets for such resources. So on slide 6, we're showing why it is possible to have this if the SDR is channeled through the African Development Bank or other MDBs and can be accounted for as equity, both from an accounting perspective and a rating agency's perspective. So it can be done through hybrid capital. So specifically, it would be in the form of a loan from shareholders from a shareholder of the bank, a loan that is denominated in SDR. And because we are a prescribed holder, we will not need to convert them into a freely usable currency. The loan will be very long dated or perpetual with an optional redemption after year 10. The hybrid capital instrument will bear the SDR interest rate as a coupon, which will therefore fully offset the cost of the SDR lender. You will recall that countries that lend or donate their SDRs must still pay the SDR interest rate to the IMF and will not be receiving any of the offsetting compensatory interest they would have earned had they kept the SDR on deposit at the IMF. So lending to the bank or through the bank, through this proposed mechanism, ensure that there is no fiscal cost to the creditor. The hybrid capital instrument will also have a loss absorption feature, such as the deferral of interest payment triggered upon specific events. The capital metrics that is proposed for the financial trigger that has currently been defined is a development asset to equity. We have also considered advanced economies' desire to maintain the reserve asset of SDR on land, namely the credit and liquidity aspect of the instrument. Reserve asset status of these loans would rest on the bank's AAA credit rating, its excellent risk management framework, and its preferred creditor status. And with regards to the liquidity aspect of the instrument, we have modeled our design on the IMS PRGT, also it's inspired from the IMS PRGT, and would enter into agreements with a defined group of strong SDR lenders with a very strong financial profile, who would be providing an unfunded contribution to support the liquidity requirements. So the level of the buffer will be commensurate with the SDR lenders' expectations, and similar to the PRGT, would be action in case the SDR providers faces a balance of payment issue. And as we continue our discussion with SDR lenders, we are also at the same time evaluating an additional structure through a trust or SPV, which would accommodate some of the potential hurdles faced by some of our potential lenders. So, and we are hopeful that we will come with alternative proposals as well as we go along within the first semester of this year. So if we go to the next slide, it's about the African Development Fund. The ADF, as we call it, it provides concessional loans with a maturity of 30 to 40 years, as well as grants to the lower income countries of the continent. And with regards to the reserve asset status, our design proposal for ADF is also inspired from the design features of the IMF PRGT. Long-dated shareholder loans received under the ADF framework for concessional donor loans will go a long way of making a difference, should they come at a volume that is substantially above what the fund would receive under a typical replenishment. And this can happen if the SDR-rich countries are willing to make that difference. Furthermore, SDR loans to the African Development Fund will create more space and allow us to allocate more grants to the most fragile and vulnerable countries. On slide 8, the SDR resources made available to the African Development Bank would be deployed into the productive economies to address Africa's core challenges and to support global development ambition, such as the UN SDGs and the African Union Agenda 2063. Be it quality infrastructure, power and energy, regional integration and quality of life. We want to support the agricultural transformation agenda in order to turn Africa into a net food exporter, improving nutrition and food security. We aim to promote an industrialization agenda that prioritizes inclusive and green economic growth and take advantage of the continent's resources. On the next slide, gender, governance, fragility, and climate change, green growth are key priorities for the bank group, and we are committed to ensuring that at least 40% of our annual banking financing goes to climate finance, climate mitigation and adaptation. We are also fully supportive of the finance in common agenda and would play a leading role in building a very strong network of public development banks on the continent, channeling liquidity and investment financing into well-structured, sustainable, and inclusive development projects. So we have a unique opportunity for the African continent, for the developing nations of this world. And the African Development Bank in particular, for Africa, is a platform that can leverage the SDR allocations and magnify their development impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Thank you both. That was very compelling. I think we will find that your slide 6 is the one that people will want to come back to on the mechanics to see how it's feasible. I should also say that if it's possible that you could just make us available the presentation for distribution, we will make sure we put it up on CGD's website so anybody who wants to download it can do so. Let me also say now for those who have been trying to follow this in French rather than in English, that the French interpretation channel has been working for a few minutes, and so that is also back on track. Please feel free to use either channel. Now let me turn to Avinash first. So Avinash, I know you've been thinking about the same set of issues. Your perspective, please, in 7 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Masood, and let me thank you and Mark and your colleagues at the CGD and all of our friends and colleagues at the Banque de France and in France for this very interesting discussion and opportunity to discuss these issues. And of course, as you, I think, said at the beginning, there are a number of ideas and not all of them are substitutes. I think many of them are complementary. I think that we heard in the last excellent presentation some ideas on how this can be used to support development and climate adaptation. The focus of what I'm going to talk about is the proposal made by Prime Minister Motley at COP26, She is Prime Minister of Barbados and also chair of the Development Committee of the IMF and World Bank. It's a proposal that captured a fair amount of imagination and intrigue. I think one of the points she made that we've had $25 trillion of quantitative easing in the past 12 years. Now, imagine if the central banks of the world, instead of purchasing government bonds and providing liquidity that way, only purchased bonds that had financed climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation. $25 trillion of funding for climate change mitigation would put us halfway to halting climate change. Today, in those 12 years, we've gone nowhere. We're nowhere near a quarter of the way or a tenth of the way or 5% of the way. And yet the economic impact would have actually been very, very similar. We would have injected liquidity. Many would argue would have an even stronger economic impact because it's financing real investment rather than the stockpiling of cash, which a fair bit of QE has ended up doing. So let's discuss this idea, and the signature features of it, which are, I would say, its scale. We're talking about a large SDR-backed trust of over $500 billion. We're also talking about its purpose, climate change mitigation. And when you're on the front line of climate change, as Caribbean countries are, you make a very strong distinction between loss and damage, the events of a climate disaster, which needs to be supported with grants, not SDRs or borrowing. Climate change adaptation, for which the RST may be a good vehicle, and concessionary funding. But those two are very focused on geography. Loss and damage, climate change adaptation is very focused on geography, where it's taking place. We're talking about climate change and mitigation, which can actually take place anywhere. So this is a global plan to advance climate change and mitigation. That's its key purpose. But I want to give a little bit of context, 2 minutes of context, and then get straight into the mechanics. And I don't need to tell this audience of why climate change mitigation is important. Everyone around this call, I'm sure, will view it with this urgency. But we do need to ask ourselves, why are we not making the progress we need to make? Why are we racing, hurtling towards 1.5 degrees of warmer temperature, which is a key tipping point for when the glaciers will melt? And this idea is really a response to the problem we're trying to solve. Why is it that concerned countries and people get together every year and otherwise, but we're still not making the progress? And I think there are 2 reasons. Economists, we like to argue that it is a global public goods problem, which is probably a way of switching off the public from understanding what we're talking about. And it is a global public goods problem. But I think there is a strong social externality aspect to it, which is why we're not making progress. So, climate change is not caused by greenhouse gas emissions. It's caused by the stock of greenhouse gases, a stock that has been accumulating since 1850 and longer. And the countries which have the greatest contribution to the stock are now wealthy countries. In fact, their wealth is related directly to their contribution to the stock of greenhouse gases. They are now older populations, affluent, and much more environmentally conscious than, say, poorer, younger populations. And they can't understand why the rest of the world aren't doing enough. But you can imagine there is plenty of scope of finger pointing of who should be doing more when the countries that are contributing most to the emissions today are not the ones who contributed most to the stock of yesterday. And the second issue is that people think that climate change is global, and the environmental activists have been right to argue it's a global phenomenon. But the reason why we're not making progress is that its first iterations, its first edition are not global, is not global. And Masood, you may remember anyone of my age who grew up in the UK will know that when we were going off to a party, turning up with a bottle of English wine was considered in poor taste. Well, English wine production has increased 5-fold in 10 years because of global warming. Global warming is actually good in the first edition for countries in the northern climes. So it's very hard to get them excited about the problem of global warming. Growing seasons have grown. They are actually, this is GDP positive. And now look at the countries on the front line. When the glaciers melt, they don't melt in the North Pole. The glaciers melt in the tropics. And that's because the water from the glaciers melting does not stay there. Because of the spin of the Earth and the centrifugal force, it ends up on the equator. The front line is between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. That's where the temperatures have increased the most, sea levels have increased the most. A few years ago, the most impactful job I had was to try and rescue Dominica from Hurricane Maria. They lost, and let's put this in the context, the tragedy of the German and Belgian floods last year cut 0.1% of German GDP. Dominica lost 226% of its GDP in 4 hours. And after the flooding damage, they had a period of drought. So that is the kind of thing we're dealing with. And this differential is why we're not making progress. The problem with, you can't deal with social externalities and global public goods with national voluntary pledges. You need a financing plan that actually incentivizes the scale of investment we need. We need investment of $2 to $3 trillion. We are not going to get that with voluntary pledging from countries that are not really feeling climate change. That's why Paris is very important for us to start off. The Paris Accord was very important for us to start off along this journey, but it will not get us to the end without a financing plan. Paris without finance is a bird without wings. So we need a financing plan. And this financing plan, where we're recommending is $500 billion in a trust. And that money is auctioned off. It is debt. It is not equity. It is debt. It has to be paid back. It is given on strong ESG conditionality. But it is very long-term, very low interest rate, perhaps on similar terms to an SDR interest rate, for instance. It's auctioned off, but you win the auction by the amount of greenhouse gases you remove or reduce. So the money is given to the projects that reduce and remove the greatest amount of greenhouse gases. So we're changing the eligibility of how this money is allocated. Now, who gets it? It could be anyone could apply for it with a good project. It could be governments, but it also could be non-governments. And that is because developing countries have no balance sheet for the $2 trillion of investment required every year for the next 30 years. They can't, there's no point giving us cheap money because as a piece of debt. They can't put it on their balance sheets. They don't have the space. They already come up for very high levels. So we have to allow this to be PPPs, to be also non-government actors, state-owned enterprises maybe with separate balance sheets, maybe even investors. Now, of course, you cannot give them SDRs. So that's why they're going to a trust. And the trust, and they're channeled into the trust, voluntary channeling into the trust. And the trust then on-lends the money that they get from these SDRs, they claim from these SDRs, and auctions off this money. But it's only to projects that will have significant returns in the long run. We know with climate adaptation that $1 spent today saves us $7 in the future. So this trust is owning assets. It is a lender, a senior lender with claims on all of the assets it is lending towards. And I therefore believe that it preserves the reserve asset qualities because A, we're not taking those SDRs into the private sector or others outside of governments, but also it is being used for the trust to be a senior lender investing in assets that are liquid because of their credit quality. So if any country wants to reclaim their SDRs and they go to the trust will have the capacity to pledge its assets to get the cash to return those SDRs. Now, of course, SDRs are a way of us perhaps mobilizing some of the $12.7 trillion of reserves that the world currently has. $12.7 trillion of reserves that are held in case of a rainy day whilst we are facing a climate crisis. Don't speak to the Dominicans about a rainy day after 226% of GDP lost in 4 hours. So we need to mobilize these resources in a responsible way. SDRs take up currently around 7% of the 12.7 trillion. There must be a cap to how much SDRs we can issue, given that they are related to the amount of reserves we have. That cap could well be well below 50%. Maybe it's 30%, maybe it's 20%. But we're not talking about getting anywhere near there. We're talking of going from 7% to 11%, say, will give us $500 billion. And as the previous presenter said, that $500 billion auctioned off will have a leveraging effect. If you offer investors 0.05% money in the long term, that will leverage at least tenfold. So we're talking about potentially releasing $5 trillion of private sector money crowded in to dealing with climate change mitigation using the $500 billion. So we're getting maximum leverage. We're also getting maximum efficiency because the money is only auctioned off to those places that will reduce greenhouse gases the most or remove greenhouse gases. Now, one of the problems with cap and trade is it kind of embeds an existing structure. It embeds existing consumption of greenhouse gases, existing stock. This idea actually allows people to come up with innovations that will remove and reduce greenhouse gases, irrespective of where. I think that we need to build in a review mechanism. We do this for $500 billion. We hopefully leverage the $4 to $5 trillion, and then we review it. What has been the wider consequences? What has been the full effect? Have we really been able to have an impact on climate change? And if it works, we can replenish this at least one more time until we show that this investment plan is working so well that we will find other ways of funding it. Let me end by saying that in any plan, any global mitigation plan, we need global support. Now, if you're a developing country like ourselves in the Caribbean on the front line, we don't care if climate mitigation takes place somewhere else. We care that climate mitigation takes place. We're concerned about loss and damage and adaptation coming in our countries, but for climate mitigation, loss and damage and adaptation are irrelevant if we don't mitigate climate at some point. So we care not where it takes place, but it takes place. So you will find the developing countries will support a global climate mitigation plan. And I think the developed countries will support it because it is their private capital, their technology will be able to bid for this money. And they will be able to support their economies as well as developing country economies. This is a global investment plan at a time when, with COVID receding, with the fiscal and monetary support from COVID receding, we need a global investment plan. So I think a climate global investment plan that draws in private sector money on the back of auctioning off very low cost money with ESG conditions, focus on who is most efficient at reducing greenhouse gases, not on the balance sheets of developing countries. I think that this is a plan that will make a difference because we do need to ask ourselves, there's a lots of talk, lots of exaltation, but we remain hurtling towards 1.5. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Avinash. Very compelling. So now we have two proposals and they've been laid out in great detail. The downside of that is that we are running considerably behind because our presenters took a little bit longer than had been anticipated. Nevertheless, we now have three discussants who will make up by being to the point and brief. But I want to really get from them their reactions to these specific proposals. And let me start first with Dodi Waluyo. Dodi, from you, I think you have two perspectives on this, right? One is a central banker. Does these two proposals make sense to you? Are they doable? And secondly, G20 chair this year, how much support is there for taking forward this MDB recycling proposals? Is there an appetite for going beyond and looking at the kind of global climate investment plan that using SDRs to prime that, as Avinash was saying? So I think we're all very anxious and eagerly awaiting your take on this. So over to you for 7 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Masood. It is my pleasure to be convening virtually with you all today. I would also like to thank the French Ministry for the Economy and Finance and also the Center for Global Development for organizing this important event. I think this builds the way forward to our concerted efforts in bolstering support for low-income and vulnerable countries. And I think it is also achieving resilience and sustainable growth. Let me begin by extending my best wishes to the French government for assuming the presidency of the European Union. On behalf of the Indonesian G20 presidency, I look forward to working closely together to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic, to recover together and recover stronger. As G20 presidency, Indonesia has committed to continue the agenda on supporting low-income and vulnerable countries and welcome the new GeneralSDR Allocation implemented by the fund on August 2021. Recycling of the SDR are a crucial option to help global recovery. In this regard, under Indonesian presidency, G20 will reaffirm our collective commitment that members with strong external positions are encouraged to voluntarily channel a share of their allocated SDR in accordance with national laws and regulation. We also welcome G20 members' pledge to support low-income countries and vulnerable countries in other means consistent with their respective national circumstances. In the G20 International Financial Sector Working Group, IFA Working Group, the meeting last week, G20 has discussed the recent progress of the G20 global ambition of the $100 billion voluntary contribution to help vulnerable countries to support their pandemic recovery, and welcome the pledges, I think worth around 44 billion thus far. Members also welcome the data call update from the IPA co-chairs with some notes on the format as well as the coverage. I'm very encouraged that support is building among the G20 members. First, members support significant scale up of the lending capacity of the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, PRGT, that provides concessional lending to most vulnerable countries. The second, members also see the need to expedite the ongoing process in designing the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, or RST, to provide affordable long-term financing to help low-income countries, small developing states, and vulnerable middle-income countries in strengthening countries' pandemic preparedness and tackling climate change. RST will be one of the critical agenda during the IFA Working Group meeting in 2022. We are of the view that RST should have strong complementarity with the fund's existing lending toolkit, and that the modalities should not duplicate with other international financial institutions, and MDB's works on the broader financing strategy for the eligible country. Some G20 members also raised the possibility to incorporate country platform as part of RST mechanism to ensure complementarity with the other MDB's work to support low-income countries and vulnerable economies. In this regard, under the Indonesian presidency, G20 will encourage the close collaboration between the fund, the World Bank, and in designing the RST and look forward the proposal ahead of the 2022 spring meeting. The IVA working group predicts the operationalization of RST by early 2023. I'm also grateful to the IMF, who have continuously supported the spirit to assist vulnerable countries by providing actionable options for G20 members to voluntarily channel a portion of their allocated SDR. However, the COVID pandemic is a crisis like no other. Thus, it is not enough to just scale up the PRGT and establish the RST to overcome this massive financing challenge. As highlighted perfectly in this conference theme, we need to further exploit the full power of SDRs as the global community is in need of innovative ways to unlock its potential. Channeling SDR through MDBs is also among the options for further channeling beyond the IMF territory for the following key reasons. First, most of the MDBs are already prescribed holders of the SDR and have the potential to operate at scale. The second, given their sectoral expertise, technical knowledge, and also experience on high-impact development projects, MDBs should play an important role in leveraging the SDR resources. And the third, MDBs lending operation have been an important foundation for multilateral collaboration, starting green recovery from the pandemic and climate transitory. However, the main concern from G20 for reallocating SDR through MDBs is the risk of losing its reserve status. Therefore, it is necessary for any proposed scheme to be able to cover both opportunity costs incurred by countries channeling their SDRs and the potential risk of losses while maintaining its encashment regime for participating lenders. If MDBs can overcome this barrier, I believe some of the proposal would have the potential to significantly increase the volume of the SDR channel support low-income countries and vulnerable countries. Beyond maintaining its reserve status, this new innovative proposal should also factor few important considerations to gain further traction under the G20 discussion. The first, it should not compete with the existing fund facility to avoid triggering window shopping. The second, a strong risk mitigation framework is warranted, particularly to provide a sustained capability in subsidizing both costs from administering the scheme and costs related to SDR channeling. As a final point, I will also want to highlight the voluntary trading arrangement FTA market as a key element for the efficient use of the SDR. Therefore, the expanded of the FTA capacity should be sufficient to meet the future demand for SDR transaction, which will likely increase steadily in period following the August 2021 SDR allocation and channeling process. Let me also note on the G20 leadership that financing issues amidst the uncertain path of the pandemic is faced by many countries globally. In this context, under the Indonesian G20 presidency, G20 will bring together global efforts to address our shared challenge. Today, we have constructively discussed some of the options, which I believe will be essential to policymakers around the world to shape a strong and resilient recovery ahead. Regardless the technical and political challenges facing those efforts, I'm confident that the G20 members, together with the fund, with the World Bank, with the MDBs and other relevant international organizations, will advance this exploration to the center of the G20 discussion. Indonesian G20 presidency stand ready to help advance this work in the coming months. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Todi. So very clear, open to the ideas going beyond RST and the PRGT, but with a clear set of guidance on the attributes that would be very important to unlock the support of the donors to that process, or the lenders to that process. Thanks for that, and we'll come back to the African Development Bank and to Avinash at some point on whether their proposals meet these criteria that Dodi has so clearly laid out. I'll turn to William now. William, I know France has been pushing this set of ideas, not only in the context of the European presidency that you have, but from last year, in fact, when you were advancing the notion of having more of a better use of SDRs, including the commitment that France made about 20% of its own SDRs being recycled. So you've listened to all the presentations, you're very deep in the discussions, you're in the IFA, the International Finance Architecture Working Group. What's your reaction to all this?
Merci beaucoup, Massoud. C'est vraiment un plaisir pour moi.
Thank you very much, Massoud. It's a real pleasure for me to be with all the people who took the floor yesterday and will take the floor today. I do remember the discussion we had a couple of months ago beside G20 in Venice, where we talked about the possibility to hold this conference in order to give the strongest push possible to all options in order to channel SDR, notably the most innovative options. And I think today's speeches showed that we have many things to do. When we were together in G20 in July, we had the G20 momentum, so to speak, and we also had the political pressure, the political will that came from the 18th of May summit that Emmanuel Monin talked about yesterday, and the President Emmanuel Macron gave a sign, a quantitative pledge, the 100 billion to be channeled, and also a qualitative in order to integrate MDBs and more particularly the African Development Bank. When it comes to G20, notably the International Financial Architecture Working Group, we've worked a lot on option within IMF, with the PRGT, with the new Resilience and Sustainability Trust. Sheila yesterday showed how important these tools are, and also their capacity to attract up to 70 to 80 billion dollars of SDR. These are two very important tools, and we have to work on them, notably the new trust of IMF. There is a first axis that they work very close collaboration with the IMF for the implementation. We're talking about the World Bank 2 collaboration between IMF and World Bank, but in countries, we must have not only the multilateral development bank, but also the regional banks like the African one. And as it was said by many a speaker, these two options have to be completed, supplemented by a more innovative option within the IMF. Why so? Well, first of all, it's a quantitative reason. We want to go to 70, 80 billion dollars to 100, and to reach the $100 billion, we have to go through multilateral banks. Those multilateral banks also are interested. That's the second point. They are making proposals, and they show that their action can be complementary to the IMF ones. The talk of the Senegalese Minister Amadou Hott showed that there were complementary actions between the actions and the tools of the development banks. Third reason to explore this MDB option is the leverage effect. As was said, the IMF option, PRGT or RST, Resilient and Sustainability Trust, the lever effect is less than 1 because of the mechanics for keeping the reserve assets. And you need to base on development bank a capital that allowed to raise funds to have a lever effect that is above 1. The proposals of MDBs are very legitimate, and we have a duty at G20, which is recognized in the release of G20 to explore these options. Fourth reason I would like to mention is a more political one, and it actually echoes the discussions that had happened last May in the Summit of Development of African Economies. It's the ownership by the beneficiaries, region or countries. Multilateral institutions have to be supported, but at the same time, you need to strengthen regional and local institutions, and more specifically, the African Development Bank. What can we do within development banks? Well, there are two types of options, so to speak. First one is PRGT or RST. This is done exactly the same way, but within an MDB. So what's the point, could you say? Because the lever effect would be less than 1. Development banks already have the capacity to raise funds. I think it is interesting to take a look at it because we know that it works. We know that the IMF has the technique to keep the reserve asset status. So this could be implemented quite easily within the MDBs. Second reason is that we are creating a pocket in which you are putting funding or financing, and you will be finance projects. And that means that this will not weigh on equity ratios of MDBs. It's the most interesting option is to use SDRs as equity or equity-like asset in order to have that lever effect. What are the hurdles to go through development banks? As was said by Dodi, there's technical difficulty. Most G20 countries has a prerequisite of reserve asset status, and there's a problem in terms of liquidity and in terms of risk. The risk must be very low. The IMF can have financial devices that can allow for this reserve assets like PRGT or RST. Is it possible to have SDR capital as equity or quasi or equity equivalent? We can have a reserve asset status on the one hand on the bank, and on the other hand, there could be an instrument that can absorb some kind of loss to development banks. Is there any solution? What the African Bank showed us goes to the right direction. It's very stimulating because there could be this idea that we could have equity equivalent as a very long-term debt, and the risk absorption would be only through reports of losses, but not on the nominal amounts. And I think this is a very interesting way. And if this is combined with what we already do at French level, for example, for PRGT, i.e. to give to our Banque de France a guarantee to cover all risks, be it liquidity risks or very residual risks, loss risks, I think we can be very close to a reserve asset status. So there's a will, and there's probably a way to get there. There is a second hurdle, which is a legal one. It depends on the countries. We can see, for example, that for Germany, any idea to land SDR is just impossible at European level, but also in other countries, in other jurisdictions, there is a very strong principle that must not be changed. You should not ask our central bank to take actions that should be taken by our budget, by the state in the framework of its budget, and this should not be changed. Still, in the European regulation, the Bank of France is allowed to make transactions with the IMF using the SDR. So the question is, what is allowed with IMF? Could it be also allowed with development banks that are prescribed holders that have the same qualification as the IMF, and that will keep the same the same conditions for preserving the rate? This is a discussion we must have between European. It is possible to adapt that European regulation in order to allow that type of transaction. We need to understand those central bankers, not only central bankers, but also us, because we self-constrained ourselves. This should not be a substitute to a recapitalization or an increase of capitals for development banks, because this should be borrowed by our budget. So France gives this message to channel SDR to development bank, but also commits with typical classical money for example, the West African Development Bank. We will contribute to its capital or equity increase, capital increase with standard money, and we do not ask the Bank of France to do it in our place. The last hurdle is a political hurdle when it comes to the calendar. As a co-chair of the G20 working group on international financial architecture, most countries consider that today the priority is to make the PRGT increase a success and to make the resilience and sustainability trust a success. We can feel that the emergency is on these two options. Second hurdle, political hurdle, I told you the legal hurdle that we had in Europe, and to raise it, we need a consensus. As the president of the European Union for this first half of year, this topic is not mature enough. That is my feeling, in order to be able to overcome the legal obstacles. And to be completely transparent with you, there are also principal blockades or ideological ones. Can SDR be associated to development actions? This is a question that is asked by some. I think that SDR are allocated for liquidity issues or for balance of payments, but they could be a space for an intelligent use of SDR with all the caveats I mentioned earlier that could allow to use this SDR through development banks. As a conclusion, there is a way, but we still need time to get something that is technically completely convincing, and also to reach the political consensus in order to have all efforts carried out for implementing that type of tools at French level. And with our partners, we are completely mobilized in order to find this way. Thank you.
And I could see that as you were talking at different points, the central bankers on our panel were reacting in enthusiasm or demonstrating some hesitation. And when the moment comes, I'm sure we'll hear from them. But I heard very clearly your call for us to try and find practical ways that respect the red lines, as it were, that have been established within countries and internationally about the role of central banks, the role of governments, how to keep them separate, but to find a way forward that allows us to creatively use the SDRs in service of the development banks and learning from the very successful and creative ways in which we have done that with the IMF. So let me now turn to our final discussant, to Jayati, for your quick reactions, please.
Thank you very much. And I will try to be brief because I know there are many very interesting comments thereafter. This has been an extremely exciting session, and I'm very happy to be part of this. I believe that both of the options that have been presented to us today are excellent, innovative, have a huge amount of potential, and in my opinion, are much preferable to the RST. I believe the RST is problematic essentially because it involves providing more debt to economies that, as Avinash Persov mentioned, already have balance sheet concerns. It will involve fiscal conditionality. It's been explicitly said so far. The current plan suggests that it's not going to be available to middle-income countries or economies that are not in the IMF programs. So it's very limited. It's not really going to be of much impact. I do believe that multilateral development banks are eligible, not just to holding SDRs. I'm quoting from the IMF Balance of Payments Manual 6. Reserve assets in excess of immediate requirements can be invested in World Bank or similar obligations and thus provide development aid. So this is already recognized. I'm sure the proposers of these schemes will have much more to say about this. But I do believe that rechallenging is urgent. So it's important to focus on the things that are immediately feasible. And therefore, I would say there are actually compelling reasons to try and combine both proposals. My personal view is that we would have to begin with channeling more SDRs to MDBs, particularly regional SDBs, which for all the reasons that are outlined, have much greater awareness of local conditions, are more able to respond flexibly to particular requirements, can leverage hugely, I would say more effectively than the World Bank. And while doing that, consider setting up a global fund, because we know that will take much more time. We know that just the design of that fund is going to take another year. And in the interim, it should not be kept waiting. The matter is too urgent. I also believe the MDB proposal is the regional bank. I will emphasize the regional development bank proposal is more compelling because it can focus not just on climate funds, but other funds related to the sustainable development goals for which developing countries are in huge and crying need. The equity option is very good. It's very available. I think the fact that it would be long-term, low to no interest rate funding is absolutely key. While it allows leverage, the interest costs are tiny, and you can absorb these interest costs in the process by charging recipients if necessary. It's still a very, very low cost, and it maintains that reserve character of the fund. So I think there is a case to actually do both. Having said that, I do believe it's important to start as soon as possible. We cannot wait. And I would therefore make a plea for countries that are holding reserve assets in excess of what they ever intend to use to start immediately, to not wait for a global consensus, to not wait even for a regional consensus. It is possible if France wants to do 20% of its reserves to go put 10% immediately into MDBs. I think it is important to do that simply to show that it can be done and that it can then have a very huge, significant multiplier effect. So I'm very excited by both proposals, and I think they're both feasible, and I think they should be done consecutively, but immediately.
Great. I think that's another rally to arms. So before I turn to Sylvie, because I think we've running out of time, there is one question which I think has been raised by the other discussers, but also in the chat that from the audience. And I want to pose this for a very quick reaction from Pacha, Belile, and Hassat, please, which is, I think the idea of channeling through the MDBs in much the same way as the RST works, or that would work, or in the same way as the PRGT would work, which is essentially a sort of one-for-one transfer without leveraging. As William said, of the two options, this is still an attractive option, and I can see it's more feasible. The real value added in a way that the MDBs bring, the regional banks bring, is the leveraging option by using SDRs as some form of quasi-capital. And that's where there is both more potential, but also more problems that you can see, legal problems, financial issues. And I want to get quickly your reaction to the second, more ambitious proposal. At the moment, are you focusing more on the first, more limited, let's just use the African Development Bank as a channel, but without the leveraging? Or are you thinking that there is potential to really exploit the leveraging power by using these SDRs as quasi-capital? Then I'm going to turn to Sylvie after that for her reaction, and finally to Emmanuel Amula for his concluding remarks. So I don't know which of the two of you would like to take that.
Asa, to go ahead, and I'll come in necessary.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now we obviously we're looking at both, but we're very much focused on the one with the leveraging capacity, and we have to do it. If you look at the mandate of the African Development Bank, which is to promote sustainable growth into the African continent, combating poverty, improving lives, and you look at the capital that comes from the African Development Bank, from other MDBs, from the bilateral, and elsewhere, it is not sufficient. So we have a duty to make sure that we make use of everything that is possible in order to direct those resources into the continent. The SDGs is 2030. Is Africa going to meet the SDG? I don't think so. I do not think so. So we are still talking about 2030. We're still talking of Africa with the SDGs, and we all know that it's not going to happen. We have today a unique opportunity with the IMF. It has unleashed a power, $650 billion, that if allocated differently, could make that difference. We have, the system that we've used is not working, so we have to think differently. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Thank you very much. I quickly just wanted to also say that I think the leveraging option is also better because it allows us to also support, the public development banks that I think William referred to in his interventions. So, I just wanted to add that as well, that it's not just the African Development Bank, but other public development banks in the region. Thank you.
Great. I think so. So clearly there's a case. So let me turn now to Sylvie Goulard, Vice Governor of the Banque de France. So Sylvie, you have been very much part of this conversation for a long time, and you've just listened to the presentations today. William also was very clear about how one could exploit the power even within the legal and institutional constraints that central banks operate in. I want to get sort of your take more generally on what you've heard, but also on the specific issue of how feasible from where you sit do you see the scope for using development banks, not just as channels, but as a way of leveraging by providing SDRs in some way to strengthen their capital base, which they can then lend multiples of. Alors, à vous, Sylvie.
Thank you, Masoud. Thank you. It was a fascinating discussion, and I say especially hello to Dodi, who is but unfortunately, we don't meet as usual, as frequently as usual. Je vais continuer en français. Je vais faire un mix.
I will switch to French. I'm going to speak a little bit of French, a little bit of English. I hope you will bear with me. So we agree with the facts. The COVID-19 pandemic struck most hardly developing countries and low-income countries. The economic growth in these countries is lagging behind comparing to world economies. And we all understand that the reason why the most vulnerable countries are struggling to react is because they have a history of structural insufficient structural facilities, and that might explain why we provide different solutions. But indeed, it's important that we find such a solution. There are some obstacles. Yes, first, indebtedness has grown, the level of debt, not only for Africa, but for the world, and also the acceleration of climate change.
Why an SDR allocation and a reallocation? Against this background, we also welcome the general decision, the general allocation decision of last summer. It was a hard work done in the G20 and around at the IMF. It is welcome, it is sizable. And yesterday, the Minister of Finance of Senegal and the Governor of Ghana stressed the importance. So we don't underestimate at all. We also know that the direct allocation for the low-income country is very limited. You know this, it was mentioned. So the idea of rechanneling is very positive, and France played a big role. It was said, I don't want to comment. But as it was mentioned by the IMF, it is not a silver bullet. And of course, as central banks, we are obliged to look at the legal framework. And first of all, maybe to remind ourselves that what are the SDR? They are supposed to meet a global need, and on this there is no doubt. And it is for the reserves. And of course, it can be leveraged. But as far as France is concerned, we work with our currency, which is the euro, and in the euro system, we have some constraints. And I think maybe because I am a lawyer, I don't want to minimize the fact that we have some legal issues we need to discuss. It was also stressed by Alessandro Rivera yesterday. So we have the way of the Poverty Reduction Growth Trust Fund. We have the Resilience and Sustainability Fund. But it is clear that for all the needs going beyond the balance of payments, all needs related to macroeconomic stability, long-term development, contribution to public goods, and several speakers mentioned very eloquently the climate change issue. I know it's very high on the topic of the G20 presidency. We cannot hide behind the reserve aspect. It is clear that, and it was said, if we want to meet the sustainable development goals, we will need other tools. We need huge investments in climate, biodiversity, but also pandemic resilience and preparedness. And here I welcome all the work that is done by the task force at the G20 as well. So we should not conceive these instruments as the only ones or the silver bullet. We can use them, I insist also, with the idea of having a catalyst in a way to increase other fundings, and as an addition to development aid, as an addition to climate funds, wherever they could come from, the 100 billions or other amounts of money. And it is a channel through which we should take into account, at least for the reallocation, the need to have some serious evaluation on how the money is used. I think it is important also, not only in the interest of these countries to make sure that money is well used, but also for the global aspect that was eloquently stressed before. So I conclude in French.
May I switch to French now so you can listen to the English booth? As William said, we are going to contribute actively within our legal constraint. As it was mentioned, we are in Europe. The French presidency will fight for it. We have done so also within the structure of the European Central Bank, but I would honestly tell you that we are not there yet, although we are working hard towards this goal. Again, a key word would be that these amounts will come in addition to the work performed by development banks in the world and in Africa as well. I'd like to salute, by the way, the work done by the African Development Bank. We will receive the IMF report shortly. That will give us an insight of how the SDR have been used and where they've been drawn. So I don't want to postpone it to next meeting, but I would like to reiterate what has been said today. We have a question that is not answered yet relating to climate change. Countries that have produced CO2 and those who have not accumulated such stock. So it is true that the IMF created in 1944 at a time where SDR existed in a system of convertibility that has been suppressed. They might not be the only instrument, and you may know that France, our president, and also the Central Bank of France, where some African countries participate in some meetings, emerging countries from other continents as well, know that we are fully motivated to fight against climate change and to act to face this challenge, because there is an urgency. And I would really like to thank you for sharing your thought. I learned a lot, although I'm aware of your work, namely in the African Development Bank.
I think the other very important point that you've raised, which you really haven't talked about, is that we need to avoid the danger of not dealing with the problem that is urgent and critical, whether it's climate change or something else, because we are trying to force a solution through the instrument of SDRs, which may or may not be the most apt for it. So let's look at alternative ways as well to deal with that problem. It has to be part of a bigger picture. So now I want to finally hand over the floor to Emmanuel Moula, who has joined us. Welcome, Emmanuel, and who started us off yesterday. So he started off our conversations. We've had 2 days of very interesting discussions, looking at country aspects, looking at innovative ways, very specific proposals from the African Development Bank, from Avinash, some very encouraging words from the G20 presidency, from the Dodi Waluyo, talking about both the openness to look at alternatives and but also to make sure that they meet certain constraints, and then some wise words from Sylvie. But also, I think a call to action from Jayati Ghosh saying, let's not delay where we can, and let's not try to find some grand global consensus before we can act at all. Those who are ready should move forward with the things that appear to be ready, even as we do more work on trying to define the best way forward on somewhat more complicated mechanisms. So we have a lot of material to take away. Emmanuel, what is your advice and guidance and concluding words as to what we should all be thinking about next? So over to you.
Merci beaucoup, Massoud, et merci à Sylvie pour ces...
Thank you so much, Massoud, and thanks, Sylvie. Dear colleague, ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, thank you warmly for taking part in this webinar, for your contributions, interventions. Thank you for the Center for Global Development. Thank you, Mark, for the co-organization of such an outstanding webinar, extremely extremely informative for all of us. And as you may know, SDR is a French passion. It was created in 39 after the conflicts between de Gaulle and the Americans on the US dollars. It has been created by a French, Pierre-Paul Schweitzer. The first allocation happened under Michel Consul, then Dominique Strauss-Kahn, another passionate of SDRs. And I'm happy that we were able to share our passion to the international community. This is a real delight to see that such an instrument is being debated and that it is useful. I believe that in the beginning we were all a bit skeptical on its pertinence. However, we have seen that during crisis, and this latest crisis, it is a useful tool. The allocation done in the midst of the pandemics is a historical moment. It has never been done at such a scale. So it's a threefold the allocation of 2009. And it has been key in our response to the crisis, which led to assist developing countries and emerging countries. Therefore, they were in a better position to face the situation they had to endure. So the last 2 days highlighted the importance of the DSN. In 2 weeks, France will have a summit between our member states and Africa. It will hopefully lead to an important contribution, being $100 billion to secure by 2022 to have enough and meet the objective defined by the G20 end of October. We, on another point, need to finalize the reform on the PRGT created in the 80s by Michel Consul. PRGT was a founding stone for the fund. It opened the fund for a more global vision, a more global action in the fight against poverty. And I know, Asud, that you have played a major role in this, in adjusting the doctrine. So thank you. This instrument helped us a lot. It helped poorer countries. I do believe that we could use PRGT as our first line of defense to allow it to lend more. Therefore, we need to implement our commitment, that is to feed PRGT with loans, but also with subsidies. And during the debates, we also mentioned the sale of gold reserves, and that might happen. So even a small amount of gold that would be sold might help to make PRGT more capable. And then we have the trust. I believe we are in a good, we're making progress. RST allows us to face today's problem, being the energy transition, preparedness to pandemics. So RST help us in our current fights. On this front, we should also move forward. We should offer 20 years loan and also widen the potential candidates for these conditional loans, so to extend them to countries that are currently not eligible to RSCT. So we are deploying efforts to achieve to this goal. And finally, all innovative options needs to be explored in order to optimize the SDR use, including via MBDs, multilateral development banks. They are already used to process DTS, development bank, the African Development Bank, or the BOAB. So we have a clear mandate from G20 to formulate innovative and original solutions that are yet to be materialized. All these actors are key for sustainable growth and inclusive growth. Their involvement is essential for development. We actively work on all these topics in Europe and also multilaterally. Hope this webinar helped to progress our discussions, move the debate a bit further. Again, I thank all participants, attendees, yourself, Masoud, for organizing this webinar, and I hope we'll move towards materializing all these ideas in the following months. Thank you very much.
Emmanuel. Thank you for being very clear about the 3 lines of activity going forward. I think we're all agreed, at least on this panel, that those are indeed the 3 important lines to advance in the near term. And I think it would be great if in 6 months' time, we could come together again to see how far we have got with the reform of the PRGT and the full financing, not just of the loans, but also of the subsidy amount, with the operationalization of the RST in ways that actually respond to the needs of the moment, exactly as you said, and with trying to go from concept to proof of concept on the 2 different ways in which the development banks could be part of this process, either as channels, which is itself useful, but perhaps also more ambitiously as ways in which you could leverage by using their power of leveraging by providing some form of quasi-equity. And I want to use this to give an open invitation right now to our colleagues from the African Development Bank, but also to everybody on this panel to come back and have that conversation whenever you are ready. So I was going to bring it to an end now, but I see that, Sylvie, you have your hand up. So I wanted to, oh, no longer. I wanted to say thank you to everyone. Thanks to everyone who participated in the seminar yesterday and today. And a special thank you to Emmanuel, you and your colleagues for being partners in the organization of this. And I want to thank also all our colleagues behind the scenes who have been so active in making this work and making sure that the 2 days went off well. So thanks, everyone.
Merci.
Thank you very much to you.
Thank you. Merci.
Moderator. Thank you.